All right. So I'm going to start off right away by sort of doing sort of the interaction part of the talk. So which one is the mitral valve? So some of you who, or a lot of you who actually see kids will actually recognize some of this, and those of you who see adults might actually go, not sure. But these are 3D echocardiograms, and if you look at them, is A a mitral valve? This one's easy. Yes. What about B? Maybe. And what about C? Yeah, so all of these are actually the mitral valve, but the fact that you could actually see the anatomy so clearly, and you don't have to look at 20,000 different 2D shots going back and forth and down into the stomach and back up to the mid-esophageal views, is amazing, and that's one of the reasons why 3D echocardiography has really taken off in clinical practice, because with this one picture, you get a lot of information on what the actual valve anatomy, structure, and including quantification actually can be. And they're actually all mitral valves in that case. This is a nice, picture just showing the mitral valve once again, and the labeling and how we can actually identify all the structures. Typically on 3D echocardiography, your echocardiographer is going to put your aortic valve at the 12 o'clock position for the 3D image, and then your left atrial appendage is always going to sit on this side over here on the left, and then you have your anterior and posterior leaflets respectively up at top and the bottom, and then here's your tricuspid valve, and then your pulmonic valve sits back here. Okay. One of the things is this en face left atrial view has really changed our assessment of prosthetic valves, because this is actually quite shadowed on the transthoracic study, but then on this transesophageal view, you could actually rotate it down. You can clearly see, this is your left atrial view, you can see the leaflets moving, opening and closing, and you can look at from the ventricular side, not as pretty, but once again, you can get a nice appreciation of this valve. And then if we look at this is a 3D. Is this normal or abnormal? Those who vote normal, if you could raise your hands. And those who vote abnormal. Oh, perfect. 50-50 shot. But most of you got it right. So this is actually, if you look at the 3D image, you see that this leaflet over here doesn't actually move very well compared to the one on this side here. And on the sort of cutoff view, you can actually see that. And in the surgery, when they actually went in, you can see that there's pannus formation all along the edge of this valve at the occluder sites. One of the big advantages of this en face view is that you could truly really see these paravalvular leaks, and you can actually put color on. And notice that this is a little bit smaller simply because to get the same frame rate, we have to sometimes shrink the box a little bit. But this is the same view of this mechanical aortic valve, and you can see that there's a big hole here. And when you put color on, you can actually see the color coming through. And one of the things we've learned from 3D is that these leaks are mostly posterior. So once again, aortic valve is up here, left atrial appendage is here. And these leaks usually last in the posterior area because they're distally located in surgical field. There's usually a circumflex artery, so the surgeon's trying not to take huge bites. There's a lot of calcium and fibrosis posteriorly, and most of this is going to really apply to adults than kids. And that there's also a annular fibrosa between the aortic and mitral valves, so it makes just a tougher region, so it actually exerts more tugging on the valve in the anterior region. So one of the things, though, when you actually find a leak, and I have to report one, is the question is, how do I communicate? So where's the leak? Where would you say this leak is? Mark, since you're looking down at your phone, I'm going to pick you. Pick on you right now. So where do you want to tell me the leak? So there, you can see there's a leak here, but the question is, how do I communicate that to you? You say it's posterior, right? Right, and that's true. And so, I mean, in the OR, when we look at the surgeon, when we talk to the surgeons for native valves, we actually talk about using the Carpentier system. And there are two other classification schemes, but the main one that we use is the Carpentier system, which breaks it up into anterior, posterior leaflets and scallops. But when we go back to these two cases, there's no scallops anymore. We've replaced it with a valve, and the valve isn't always oriented in the same way on each patient. So how do we actually communicate here? And if you have one leak, maybe it's easy, but what if you have two leaks, like this one over here? There's one here and one here that you can actually see. Well, Mark did these anterior, posterior, and this is one of the original ways that was reported in 1992 about how to break it off. Basically, you go through your aortic valve, and then you divide your valve into quadrants, and there's anterior, septal, posterior, and lateral. However, it's not very precise, because if you sit over here, if your leak is over here, that's a lot different than being over here, and that's more lateral, and then it becomes very hard to actually communicate. So this is a nice paper out of the Montreal group. I actually tried to standardize the description. And what they did was where the aortic valve is, they actually located that as sort of 11 degrees, between 11 and 12 degrees. And then they do a clock face. Okay, and then they go around the clock, and they correlated that to what the angiographic view would be. So this would be your oblique view, left oblique view, and you can actually see that there's your aortic valve, and once again there's your mitral valve, and that's where the 12 o'clock would be. And they related this to the typical echo views that we have, basically a 4-chamber view, 2-chamber view, and a 3-chamber view. And I'll show you an example here of what it actually means. So here's our 3D data, and you can see there's a leak at the sort of just below the 9 o'clock and the 3 o'clock position. And if you go with their 4, 2, and 3, this should be the 3-chamber view, you can see that that you can then more precisely locate where the leak is actually located. In this patient, there's 2 leaks, and we can actually tell them where it's located. And so this is one of the ways when we do report it, we actually say it's around 3 or 4 o'clock, and that's what we mean. But one of the problems, though, is that this is the original paper, and if you look at the lining of this, the 0-degree view, which is our usual 4-chamber view, it's just offset to the aortic valve, and you're getting a 4-chamber view. But if you look at the ASC echo guidelines, we've actually co-opted that and actually made 12 o'clock right at the aortic annulus. So you have to be aware that we've actually shifted this a little bit, and it's not exactly offset to the aortic valve, but it's actually going straight through the aortic valve as our 12 versus our 6, as opposed to just being slightly off as in the original paper. And that's one of the things that we actually need to pay attention to. And you have to know how your echocardiographer is actually reporting that. But because the standard for the echo guidelines are to use it at 12 o'clock, we've actually off-shifted this a little bit. Now, some people still use the Carpentier method for reporting leaks. That's not very common, but there are people who do that. And once again, they just basically take the superimposed A1, A2, A3 views, and they just put that on top, but that's not very popular. Now, in terms of 3D echocardiography, you can actually get the number and location of the echo. You can actually go down with multiplanar analysis for your 3D data set. And what you basically do is take your 3D data set and you cut it down until you get down to the level of the hole. And when you actually go down there, you often realize a lot of these holes are not perfectly shaped. They're not circular. They're actually a crescentic with a little bit of irregularity, and there's usually a pointy side and maybe a more dollar side. And that you realize that sometimes when you put in your plugs, they actually slide to one side or the other when we look at these because of the way that the leaks are actually shaped. You can quantify the severity of the regurgitation. I'm not going to go into that, but we can actually do that with the color Doppler here. And then, of course, we actually do a lot of guidance for the procedures. Once again, this is sort of doing your interatrial septal puncture. This is with a 3D mode called biplane, and you can get both your biconventional view as well as a short axis view with the aortic valve over there. And then we can also do some live 3D where you can actually see it. Now, I don't know if any of you actually how your procedure room works, but it's great that I can tell you it's at 3 o'clock, but when we're in the procedure room, you can sometimes hear this sort of who's on first kind of conversation. I'm going to, Eric, move left, left, left. No, your other left, your other left. And he's going, I don't know what left. Tell me, anterior, posterior.
It's like, you guys, I don't see that.
And we're like, look at the picture. And he's like, I'm looking, but he doesn't see it. So one of the things that actually is coming up in the lab, and if you have a couple of $1 million to retrofit your lab, is this fusion imaging that actually exists. And this is a Philips example. And what you can do is that you can place a marking on the echo, and then it actually shows up on your fluoro. And then you can actually use that to guide your intervention. And I actually think that will ease and shorten a lot of the time we actually spent trying to communicate. You can actually do it for your interatrial site of puncture as well as for your place to place the paravalvular leak. All right. And then there, hopefully this is your final result, that you actually have a plug in your hole. Okay. Now, to assess your paravalvular leak when you get these patients coming through your clinic, do you use echo? How many people use echo? I should hope that everyone's hands would go up, please. Otherwise, I'm going to be out of business. How many people use cardiac CT? Not a lot of people. And how many people use cardiac MRI? Perfect. Then we're all in agreement, because I tried to find some CT and MRI cases, and I couldn't because we actually don't do that at our center. But if you look at the statement that was released in 2017, just in the last month, about clinical trials for paravalvular leak, you'll see that echo is actually recommended, as it takes up almost half the table, and then fluoro has a little line here, and then cardiac and CT are almost half the table. But really, if you actually read through the details, there isn't a lot of recommendation for that because there isn't a lot of data for that. And I'll actually show you some of the studies. For CT, it's basically to locate calcifications, to look at mobility of the discs, and so you can get a location and size of the paravalvular leak, and you can actually pick up PANIS on that. But on MRI, it's mainly for ventricular velocities, and you can quantitate regurgitant volumes using flow and get effective regurgitant orifice. But once again, it's very limited utility for paravalvular leaks. And then if you look at the actual assessment for grading, if you look at the schema that they provide from here all the way down, and then MRI doesn't even get its own little line. It gets like own little heading. It's actually pushed down, and it's one little line at the bottom. So echo is really your main technique for assessing that. But that being said, people are using CT, and this is a nice study that was performed that looked at about 204 patients. And when you look at CT in terms of identifying presence or absence of a paravalvular leak, it actually has similar sensitivity and specificity compared to TEE and accuracy compared to TEE. But once again, the agreement though for actually size of the leakage and the for in terms of area and perimeter, the correlations are actually quite low. But CT, albeit, does give you extra information about PANIS on the study that you don't necessarily get from the TEE. So when Eric first sent me the talk, he wrote VIV, and I was sleep deprived or something. I couldn't figure out what VIV meant. And so, but if you Google it, actually, VIV stands for all these things, an intelligent platform. It was actually by the creators of Siri have created this artificial intelligence platform called VIV. And that's the first thing that shows up for the first 25 hits now. Yes. And then also other things you want to talk about, valve and valve. So let's move on for that. So valve and valve, I don't need to tell you any of that. It all started off with sort of the Melody and the Sapien valve in the mitral position for patients with previous valves. And of course, now there's development of new valves for native valve disease. So when you talk about one, and you kind of have to talk about both of them because a lot of the evaluation actually is very similar for them. And so I'm going to show you sort of the thoughts that would go into a process. So this is a patient where we did a valve-in-valve procedure. You can see they had a bioprosthetic valve that had deteriorated with tears in the leaflets with severe regurgitation. Of course, then we put in a valve, and it looks great now. And one of the things that we do, is that there's this concern about LVOT obstruction. And the literature that I could find, it basically says about 12 to 13%, regardless of experience, when they put a TAVR valve in the mitral valve position. And so there's big concern about this LVOT obstruction area here. And there's a couple of ways that have been suggested for analyzing this. And one of them is the actual angle between the aortic and the mitral valve. And usually they're saying an angle less than 90 degrees going this way is probably what they would recommend. Now, I have a couple of issues with that. First, that measurement where you're taking the middle of the long axis of the aortic valve in the middle of the mitral valve and getting the angle this way, I actually think it's highly variable when you actually do it. When I looked at the CTs on this patient, there was actually 4 or 5 different measurements that were done, and they all were very different because it's not very standardized because you don't actually have any landmarks there. On echocardiography, the way I actually think about the aortic mitral angle when we talk about it is actually we take the landmarks that we have, the annulus of the mitral valve and the annulus of the aortic valve. Those don't move in patients. And then from there, you get the angle between that. So that's, I actually think, might be a better way of doing it in the future, but that's my personal thought. So that's how I would suggest that. But 90 degrees is sort of what's found in the literature. And then there's this nice CT paper or recommendation of actually where you can actually take CT data and then put a pseudo valve in and then look at the neo-aortic valve area and look for the narrowest spot in systole. And usually we know from the Hokum literature less than 2 centimeters square is actually a bad prognosis or bad outcomes for these patients. And that's sort of what they're using right now in the literature. Okay, mitral annular sizing, that's one of the biggest things right now in imaging in terms of the transcatheter mitral valve placements. It depends on where you ask, but mostly echo is used to screen patients and then CT is used to confirm the size of the valve. But one of the things about CT sizing is that there's this, as we all know, this mitral annulus, if you look, is a saddle shape, and it's got this nice rise right where it meets the aorta, and the lowest point is at the commissures, and the highest point is the anterior and the posterior areas. But if you look at, and the thing is, if you look at the literature, the valves that are being developed right now, they're trying to develop this D-shaped annulus where it's very flat in this anterior portion rather than curved as it going forward. And part of the fear, once again, is that they want to avoid, if you have a valve that's actually measured, taking into account this anterior mitral continuity, that you'll end up with obstruction in your LVOT rather than if you keep it circular versus if you just cut it off there and then size for that. And so that's one of the reasons for that. And there have been papers, there is a nice paper that came out last year that showed that CT measurements and echo measurements, when you actually do the same measurement, whereas you take the 3D data and you do this planar D-shaped measurement rather than doing the traditional 3D measurement that we do, you can actually get very, very high correlations in terms of circumference, area, the trigone distance, as well as the septal-lateral. So it's actually a viable, reproducible technique with CT and 3D echo. And that's whether or not it's the best measurement to use, that still remains to be seen. CT, of course, can tell you of calcium, and once again, if you have a lot of calcium, you're measuring the valve area on the inner edge of the calcium to actually size it. And finally, other things that are of concern that your imager would be looking for is if you have significant prolapse, the device crushed against the prolapse may leave a little leak. If you have very tended cords, you may be too low in the LV when you place it. And once again, a prosthetic valve may actually interfere with your function of both valves when you finish. Finally, as I get to the end of it, other things you want to look for, whether it be on MRI or echo, is you want to look for suitability if you're going through the transapical approach, the LV apex, and if you're looking at the transseptal approach, you want to look at the intratracheal septum. And you also want to make sure, a lot of these devices are very big and bulky, that your left atrium is actually quite large and you can have enough room. Lots of things to assess for after procedure, usually done by echo. And then one final point that I think that is forgotten a lot of the times when we get excited by these new technologies is the LV function, especially for the mitral valve. This is a patient who had a mitral valve, and it's actually quite normal, maybe not quite hyperdynamic as you would like. And one of the things you have to remember when we get is that LV size and function measurements aren't very reliable in the severe mitral regurgitation because of the offload. And so often, if you see someone with a normal EF that's reported by the echocardiographer, it probably is actually reduced, and we actually have to keep reminding people that we're not dealing with normal LVEFs. In this patient, we got a little bit lucky. There is a bit of a deterioration in LV function after the valve and valve went in, but it's actually still not that bad. So in summary, 2D and 3D echocardiography is the main imaging modality before, during, and after these mitral valve procedures. CT and MRI offer complementary information, and over time, I think it'll be sort of like TAVR, where we'll do a combination of imaging to get the information we need. And then I just put a little table here just to sort of quickly point out that there's lots of advantages and disadvantages to each of these techniques. And so depending on what your patient in front of you has, that's how you're going to choose what you use. And then I'd like to acknowledge the other imaging team members at the UHN, Melina Mazzotti, who does a ton of our procedures, and Jennifer Day.